The average rent in San Francisco is reaching $3,500, and to comfortably afford that, you'd need to make about $60 an hour, and there's just fewer options for financing affordable housing through federal or state means, and a lot of residents of the Bay Area are looking for new options, and a lot of them are turning towards community land trusts. So this is about financing community land trusts. What is a community land trust? A CLT is a nonprofit entity that buys properties to preserve and create permanent affordability. The CLT owns the land while renting or leasing the building to maintain affordable rates. A lot of targets across the United States, the typical resident is at about 120% AMI, but a lot of Bay Area institutions try to aim lower than that. The objective of CLTs, the mission, is often what unites CLTs and is sort of the driver. So the mission is treating housing not as an individual asset, but as a human right. And a lot of CLTs are driven by a mission towards anti-displacement and anti-gentrification. So that is mostly the motivation behind creating CLTs. CLTs have their origins in American Black liberation politics in the creation of New Communities Incorporated in Albany, Georgia. So they have their origins in Georgia. So this was founded by Charles Sherrod, who was a former SNCC Southwest Georgia project director. He and 6 others traveled to Israel to study the kibbutz land trust system. More particularly, they took examples from the Jewish National Fund. This was after this was into the occupation of Palestine, and I'm not really sure what the American Black liberationist perspective was on the displacement of Palestinians from their land. But much like the United States philosophies around land ownership, often erase and contribute to the genocide of the indigenous people, and I feel like a lot of CLTs have since learned from that. But the intent of New Communities and their leading example of the kibbutz system was on separating the ownership of the land and the leasing of the resources. So this was meant to support the autonomy and liberation of Black people in the South, and this was used as a response to the systemic racism embedded in housing and land ownership. So this was motivated by agriculture, but as CLTs evolved, it sort of turned towards affordable housing. It was adopted into affordable housing practices. So one of the more recent examples in the Bay Area, one of the more recent acquisitions comes from the BACLT, where Inti Fernandez, a resident in South Berkeley, learned that his landlord had passed away in 2020. And while he and other tenants described her as very generous and more than willing to provide affordable units, they soon realized that all this depending on like one individual led to their vulnerability, because the family, they started to do these renovations and they started to bring on potential buyers. And so Inti created the South Berkeley Neighbors Group, who then reached out to the BACLT to try and save this complex. So what ended up happening is that over 3 years, they finally reached the approval of Berkeley's first small sites program. And this led the city council to invest $10 million into this SSP, $3.6 million of which was granted to the BACLT for the acquisition of Inti's complex. And then through another nonprofit lender, they were able to begin renovations and sort of start the upkeep and maintenance and going forward with this property. And I believe that most of the residents were able to stay. So this is an example of tenant-led and tenant-initiated acquisition and rehabilitation of an existing building and property. So this is mostly with the goals of anti-displacement from rent increases or change in ownership, because change in ownership, even without directly increasing rent or dramatically increasing rent, can still pose challenges and endangerment to residents. There's also CLTs in the Bay Area, mostly in Petaluma and Napa Valley, so not as dense urban centers, that act partly as like developers. So they also channel funds towards construction of new buildings, as well as rehabilitation and acquisition. But this is a little bit more unique, and it's not as concentrated in San Francisco and Oakland and Berkeley. So how do CLTs get their financing? They get it through public funding, through affordable housing grants, or things like SSPs when it comes to municipal support. They get philanthropic support from community investors and donors. They use loans and impact investments. So these are low interest loans from community development financial institutions, or CDFIs. They also benefit from resident contributions, which are fees and limited equity payments, and then they partake in fundraising and partnerships. These are led by the nonprofit itself. So in the case of the Bay Area, these CDFIs are the LISIC, the Bay Area branch of LISIC, Housing Accelerator Fund, Self-Help Credit Union, and all of these sort of fall under the coordination of Partnership for the Bay's Future. CDFIs, they sort of act as an intermediary for funds of public and private dollars and public and private lenders. I think a lot of the benefit of CDFIs is creating community trust and partnerships, and sort of acting as people who certify the credibility of a lot of CLTs and work towards creating a network of them. So, but people behind the CDFIs, a huge one is Kaiser Permanente. They funnel funds through LISIC. The LISIC overall is a accumulation of lenders and private partnerships. When it comes to public funding, the small size program is a huge example of this, but also state and federal dollars. Philanthropic support, one really interesting example comes from Mackenzie Scott. In 2023, she donated $20 million to the SFCLT. Of course, this is a fraction of her multi-billion net worth at the time, but she's been working on that. Like, that was like part of her goal to, like, I don't know, donate how much of her wealth towards whatever. By the time she dies, it was something crazy. But $20 million in 2023 towards SFCLT. Then there are resident fees, like the property lease and CLT fees, which are meant to support the board and other management. And then there are other forms of financial relief. This can come as in San Francisco, the transfer tax exemption for acquisitions of over $5 million. And then there is LIHTC, but tax credits, while they are a major source of funding for affordable housing in California, they are highly competitive, and projects often to be competitive enough for these have to be above a certain number of units. And then a lot of lenders don't really go for community land trusts, because the decision making of the land trust and the lender and the developer, or everything, and like the cooperative nature of it can be out of a lot of people's experience, and so it's not really prioritized for these. So these are a bunch of things that lead towards the next example. The rent stabilization ordinance had a loophole that was only closed in 2023 that made it so that landlords who use city funds to make repairs no longer had to abide by the RSO. And so while a lot of tenants, weren't privy to this for a long time, it became a catalyst for people who had changes in management to see their rents sort of spike out of nowhere. The small size program, mentioned a couple times already, prioritizes buildings of 5 to 40 units. So if you didn't meet this sort of constraints, like maybe you were only trying to preserve like a 1 unit household or something, like this was not, like you would not qualify for this. But another extreme, if you were over 40 units or at 40 units, you would also not be prioritized. COPA, the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act, allows nonprofits first bids when properties go for sale, and I forgot to mention this, also allows tenants to have the first right of refusal. All this accumulated to the acquisition of 285 Turk Street in the Tenderloin of San Francisco. So it was at 40 units, so it just kind of was not a priority for a small size program. LIHTC would not allow sufficient funds, but it was bought for $9.4 million with 0 public dollars and 2 private lenders, and then contributions, as it says, as small as $20. What was crazy about this is that it lost its rent control status in 1985, but when it was acquired by real estate mogul Naviya Moser comes up again, it saw rent increases of 5 to 25%. So it got, so as of CLT acquired this after that, when it got two loans from 2 CDFIs, and was able to save a lot of tenants from being displaced. How these funds are spent, it's spent in the permanent financing of the CLT of the property, which is basically the land acquisition. There are funds being drawn from repairs that are paid for by fees for upkeep, and then there are, very notably, there also has to be fees that go towards the organization to the nonprofit. So the board of directors of a CLT are made up of nonprofit members and of residents. There is a lot of priority and a lot of CLTs towards listening and putting forward tenants in a lot of the decision making around a CLT. And this comes to some contention because, as one organizer puts it, it's inherently putting a lot of labor on low-income people and saying your affordable housing is enough to pay you for your labor. So a lot of CLTs are grappling with how do we compensate labor when it's inequitably allocated, and a lot of these CLTs rely on people putting in a lot of time and a lot of effort into just keeping their home. So all this to say, or something on top of this, this article came out pretty recently that Moser could lose more than 400 units of housing across 14 buildings, a lot of which are located in very gentrification prone and a very Black, Indigenous, people of color occupied buildings, especially in the Tenderloin. Charles Moser, who founded the company in 1955, was described in his obituary as a voracious dealmaker who considered it a sin to sell property once it was acquired, and he owns more than 35 apartment buildings and 4 hotels at the time of his death in 2007. So his son owns the company now, but his sister, or the son's sister, is trying to make claims that he's mismanaging everything. That son being Envio, who was raising rents for people in the Tenderloin and that Turk Street property. What's been happening is that they've received receivership orders, which typically occurs when 2 parties, like a landlord and a lender, are in disagreement. So these buildings are not for sale yet, but they have already received notices for public auction. So with the aforementioned COPA Act, there is potential for CLTs to swoop in, but there's also the acknowledgement of, how robust are these CLTs? How prepared are they to meet the very constrained timeline of COPA? And while there's like a lot of optimism around Monster losing these properties, it's really going to depend on moving quickly, really fostering these connections that seem to have been strengthened over time, and careful site selection. But there are a lot of people at risk here, but there is also a lot of potential to getting these properties into the right hands if we look towards the CLT model. Anyways, that is it. Thank you very much, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.